Hello.
To reassign the interpretation.
Great. Should we just turn off interpretation and then like do it all over again?
Yeah, I think Andrew's just done it all. So
yes, I don't have it anymore. Hi, Francisco. Sorry, I was on another assignment, and Doug said just leave and go.
Okay. Sorry, I was getting really nervous. I was about to bust out my very, very rusty French. So I'm so glad that you were here at least.
I'm sorry. And you know what? I had an issue with time. You said be there at 10:45, and I thought I had an hour. And like, oh my God. Anyway, Doug said drop because it's his assignment too, the other one. So anyway, here I am.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. And I think the French and Spanish interpretation have just been enabled.
Okay, I'll just check Pat's first really quickly.
Yes.
Perfecto. Luego muy bien.
Wonderful.
And I'll check Beatrice's very quickly. Parfait. On t'entend parfaitement.
Great. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for your patience. We'll go ahead and get started with our first keynote of the day. So it is a great pleasure for me to welcome Dr. Radhika Khosla, who is an associate professor at the Oxford Smith School of Enterprise and Environment and the School of Geography and the Environment, and also the research director of the Oxford India Center for Sustainable Development. So as you can see from her many appointments, she has a very broad background spanning physics, geophysics, and many other disciplines. And she draws on these interdisciplinary techniques to study urban transitions in developing country cities and the tensions that this gives between improving quality of life and also sustainability goals and climate change mitigation. So I'm very happy to welcome her today to be our first keynote speaker.
Thank you so much, Irene, and thank you to all the organizers for having me here. This is an unusual audience for me, and so I'm definitely here to learn. And it's been interesting to think about giving a talk on climate change and sustainability in the context of development to a sort of non-specialized audience. So I'm looking forward to doing that, and thank you again for having me. What I will do now is share my screen. All right, and I'm going to walk you through this question of sustainability transitions in a changing climate and link to the question of how we address this in the context of development. And I'm going to draw from the example of India while I do that. And I'm looking forward to talking with Araba after that on some of the themes that emerge, and then also with members from the audience. Now, let's begin by sort of taking a step back to about 400,000 years ago, when we look at CO2 levels that have existed for the Earth. And this is an image that many of us might have seen before, but there's almost a certain way in which we're immune to looking at these. But if we take one more look at it, what we see is that over these 400,000 years, we've seen carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere go up and down, and they've usually varied between sort of below 200 to about 300 parts per million. But then if you zoom in to the sort of rectangular box up front, if we start looking back about 1,000 years, something very different starts happening, and you see a spike up in carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere, which just sort of zoom up 1800 onwards, so post-industrial revolution. And where we are today, so this was a number that I had pulled in June, and we're now at 420 parts per million in terms of carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere, and that is more than it's ever been over this 400,000 years. So it's really much larger over a very extended period of time. And we've tried to address this problem globally, right? Like we've been trying for the last 30 years to think through and act in international climate change negotiations I want to remind us that the first negotiations took place in 1992, and that is a long time ago. I know we're all looking forward to the COP discussions that are later this year, it's the big climate change conference that's going to take place in Glasgow. But these conferences have been going on a long time, and since the first COP, which was in '95. Humans have emitted more than 765 billion tons of carbon dioxide, and the mean surface temperature is now 1.1 degrees Celsius higher than what it was in the pre-industrial world. Just in terms of context, the science tells us very clearly that if we hit 1.5 degrees of warming, we're basically looking at unprecedented changes in the way we live, in the sorts of impacts we would see, and the kinds of extremities that we'd have to deal with. And we are already at 1.1 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial warming. And we're warming, the Earth is warming at about 0.2 degrees C per decade. So it's warming faster than ever. And at the rate we're going to reach that 1.5 degree target anywhere in the next 10 to 20 to 30 years. And that is real cause for worry, because as we've seen, and these are just images from the last few years, every time I do this, there are so many more examples of the types of extremities that we're seeing, where you have areas that are completely unprepared for floods or warmth or heat waves or wildfires that are interrupted, and there is immense loss of life because of these extreme weather events that are no longer rare, but rather have become quite common. So, the big question for us is can climate change be solved? And it's very hard to think about solving climate change, because climate change is what is technically called a super wicked problem. And what is a super wicked problem? A super wicked problem is one where you have many interrelating aspects. So these problems are economic, they're political, they're social. At the same time, they also they're biophysical. So they involve the atmosphere, the ocean, biological systems, and they're so complex with all these different variables that they become very difficult to think through in terms of solutions. What we do know is that we need to reduce CO2 emissions to zero. That's where we need to get to if we are to get to a point where we need to curb warming. And the IPCC 1.5 degree report lays out two ways in which we can do that. There are basically only two ways in which we can get to that temperature target, and the graph on the right-hand side here tells us that you don't need to sort of, look into it too carefully. But if you notice, there are 4 different scenarios where warming can stay below 1.5 degrees. And out of those 4 scenarios, there are 3 that have the red in it and only 1 that doesn't have the red. Now, the red is the use of negative emission technologies. So that is the use of technologies that allow you to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So that is either through capturing carbon dioxide from the air, storing it under the earth. There are different kinds of new ways in which we're thinking through negative emission technologies. None of these is really available to scale right now. The only other way we can get to 1.5 degrees is if we take a serious look at energy use and reduce energy use. So really, energy in some sense lies at the heart of how climate change can be thought about in terms of being solved if solving per se was possible. Now, the problem with energy, and this is really a problem that is so it's so poignant in the developing world, is that we're now looking to a future where we need more energy as the planet, as population, as as sort of people across countries. We are looking to a future where we need much more energy, more than we've needed ever before. But we need to do it, and we need to consume in a way with much fewer emissions. And that kind of future has never really been one that we've considered, because up to now we've consumed a lot of energy, but always done it by having many more emissions. Now we need a future where you have more energy, but with fewer emissions. And this is complicated because energy use is continuing to rise. It is still dominated by fossil fuels. Fossil fuels are necessary because in many ways, in many countries, they still underpin modern life and energy security. And providing energy security to people is a priority for development. So, for example, in 2014, which was not that long ago, more than 3 billion people had no access to clean cooking fuels. And that is that's half of the world's population not having access to clean cooking. And in 2018, for the first time, the world's population without access to electricity fell below 1 billion. And that's a milestone. It's a milestone to be able to say that the number of people who don't have access to electricity is below 1 billion. I mean, there's still an appalling number that don't have access, but even so, there's progress being made. But this progress has come with a lot of uncertainty around how these different transitions, whether the transition is towards more energy use, whether it's towards energy access, whether it is towards urbanization, whether it's towards clean cooking or towards decarbonization, how are these different transitions going to pan out? So the question of climate or development is then really important because in many ways that is where a lot of this is going to unfold. And again, what we know from the science is that to be able to build infrastructure in fast-growing cities in developing countries, we're going to use about 4 times the amount that was used to build developed world infrastructure. So basically, in the developing world, in some sense, because of the stage of development that it's at, is going to consume, if it continues on business as usual, large amounts of carbon dioxide to be able to reach levels of development that many of the Western countries are at today. And that poses serious complications for the climate future of the world. But these complications are not just about carbon budget or climate futures. There are also serious ethical dilemmas about who has the right to develop, and is that quality of life available for all or not? So I'll tell you a little bit more about what I mean. Now, we can ask the question, we've ended up in this sort of climate crisis, and who is responsible for it? So if we look at this graph here, it tells us that who the largest annual emitters of carbon dioxide emissions are in terms of countries. So this is going back to about 1800. And you can see that, and on an annual basis, right? So on a year-by-year basis, who emits the most? And you can see that China is, is up there, as is the United States, as is the EU, India, Russia. And so these are countries that in the last sort of 10, 15 years have been emitting large amounts of carbon dioxide on a yearly basis. And there is an argument to be made that this is where responsibility lies in terms of creating the problem. Now, the trouble with sort of data in some sense and how we cut our data is that we can use our data to tell us what we wanted to tell us, right? So if we look at things in another way, there's a different image of responsibility. So if we look at cumulative emissions, which is who is responsible for the emissions that have accumulated in the atmosphere since 1800. And the reason why cumulative emissions is important is that carbon dioxide is a gas that lives in the atmosphere for 200 plus years. So it doesn't matter, it's agnostic to when it was put into the environment, whether it was put into the environment yesterday or whether it was put in 150 years ago, it is still producing the same warming. So cumulative emissions, therefore, are really important from a climate perspective. And if we look at who is responsible in terms of putting the most amount of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, we see a very different set of countries which emerge. The United States comes up front, then the EU, China, Russia, United Kingdom, and then countries like India and Brazil are much lower down on that list. Now, there's yet one more way in which we can do this, which is to say, what about emissions per person? Because different countries have different populations, and the sort of there's a large school of thought that thinks that the right way to calculate responsibility is to say, as an individual living in one of these countries, how much have I contributed to the problem? And if we look at it in that way, you see another very different set of numbers which emerges, which is that in the United States, per person emissions are the highest followed by Japan, which again is a country that wasn't showing up in the previous two slides, then China, and then the United Kingdom, and then India again is much lower. So, you know, I think in the context of those of us who work with numbers, this question of how responsibility is allocated is really one that we've not been able to sort out completely in our climate debate. And in a way, it's been at the heart of why we've not been able to think through a solution, because there's this constant pointing of fingers between countries in terms of who really created this mess to begin with. So, you know, responsibility aside, I think what is important about development is that in a way, there's also an opportunity within it, right? We're also at a place at the planet where we can't just point fingers and the negotiations, but even the state of the atmosphere in some sense demands that everybody now acts towards this issue. And developing countries actually have an opportunity here. They have a moment to do things differently, because when you build infrastructure, you actually are locking in consumption patterns for a long time to come. So buildings, roads, transportation, bridges, these are all some of the longest living components of any economy. You know, once you put them in place, they're there for 50 years, 100 years, even longer. And so there is a real moment in developing countries to be able to shape such infrastructure in a manner that it leads to a low carbon way of living. And the reason why that is important is that how individuals live, how you and I live, is actually approximately responsible for 2/3 of global greenhouse gas emissions. So households like yours and mine are responsible for 2/3 of global greenhouse gas emissions. And the main ways in which that plays out is in the way that people use mobility in homes, so in the residential space, and then in food. And each of those areas is actually responsible for about 20% of global lifestyle emissions. And so there are, these are pockets in some sense where you can think through the question of not climate or development, but rather how can you have both? What are the ways in which societies are able to develop and be able to reach a quality of life that is that is one that everyone deserves, but do it in a manner that actually does not kill the planet, but is one that is low carbon or zero carbon. Now, I use India as a way to talk about some of these issues, but also to demonstrate some of the tensions that come about when we are working in the context of a developing country. Now, India is an interesting example because in some sense, what happens in India in the climate context is relevant not just domestically, but it has global relevance. And the reason for that is that, as I was just saying, the largest proportion of global energy demand growth is going to come from developing countries. That's where the biggest demand is going to be. And in terms of energy demand, the largest energy demand globally is going to come from India. And so what happens in India in some sense is important globally. And the question is, how do we negotiate that tension between growing energy consumption for development and protecting the environment? So let's take a step back and let's, just contextualize India a little bit in the global context. So if we look at GDP numbers, India is in the top 5 economies of the world. It is placed with countries like Russia, China, Germany, and so it's sort of, it's seen as an emerging economy. If we look at total greenhouse gas emissions, India is in the top 3 emitters globally. So when it negotiates in climate negotiations, it negotiates with these big superpowers because itself is a big emitter. And so there's this real sense that it is this emerging economy. However, the other side of the coin is that it also has elements that look very different from that of an emerging economy, but rather one, as a colleague has said, of a premature power. So if we look at things like GDP per capita, India actually ranks very low. If you look at the multidimensional poverty index, which is an index that looks not just at poverty as a function of income, but also around indicators of education, of health, India actually ranks really badly, much closer, to sort of say its neighbor Bangladesh, as opposed to other countries that it is clubbed with in the negotiations. And similarly for greenhouse gas emissions per person, India's greenhouse gas emissions per person are much lower than with some of the other countries. So there's this interesting duality in the case of India, where it negotiates and positions itself, with the large superpowers, but in many ways, some of its other indicators are really those of a very different set of countries and point to a very different set of circumstances that underlie the domestic context. So the interesting thing about the region is also that at the moment it's shaping and participating and undergoing a number of different impending transitions. First of which is urbanization, and the largest urbanization transition in history is taking place in the country right now. So Indian cities will host 200 million more people by 2030, and the urban population is set to double by 2050. It's not just urbanization, it's also infrastructure. So 2/3 of the buildings that will exist in 2030 are to be built between 2010 and 2030. So that's just an enormous amount, and an equivalent in some sense to building a new Chicago every year. And in terms of access, about 800 million people still lack access to clean cooking. So again, you can see that there's this real sort of contradiction in some sense, where you have huge urbanization, huge infrastructure growth, huge gaps of access. And these uncertainties make it very difficult for sort of accurate modeling and scientific sort of projections around how the future will unfold. I'll point to that in this graph here. So this is some of the work that we had done before the Paris negotiations. And if you look at the left-hand side, the y-axis, so these are the projections for what carbon dioxide emissions for India would be in 2030. And the x-axis is different growth rates, because again, that's another place of uncertainty in development is, you don't know what rate the country is going to grow at. And if you look at the different dots, all the dots are their different studies. So they're different modeling studies. And what we did was we wanted to get a sense of what do the sort of the best modeling studies, the studies that the government uses or has commissioned, what do they tell us about where India will be in 2030? And you put all these studies on the map and you actually see that they're all over the place. And actually the range of projected emissions, so the range of what the emissions will be in 2030, the uncertainty in that range was as much as the current emissions, right? So there is almost 100% uncertainty in where the country is going to end up. And again here, I'm sort of using this example as a way to point to some of those tensions that come up when you're trying to make such assessments under the context of the multiple transitions that are taking place in a developing economy. Now, in India's case, these transitions and these uncertainties are linked to both questions of energy demand and supply. It's not clear, is the future of Indian energy one of coal, or is the future of Indian energy one of renewables and solar? We're now at a place where solar prices are very close to coal prices, even cheaper, but a large part, 60%, 70% of the country's energy system is projected to be fossil fuel based and coal based. And so it's an open question. Similarly, what is the country's demand future going to be? Is it going to be, what is the manner of urbanization? Is it going to be urbanization that is energy efficient, or is it going to be energy inefficient? And all we know in some sense is that demand will grow, but that magnitude of what the demand will be is amenable to intervention. And the energy models themselves show an uncertainty of 150% for 2030 projections. And that is, it is a very large amount of uncertainty from which to make informed policy choices. Now, I'll use the rest of the time I have to give some examples from the work that we've been doing, focusing on residential electricity use, because that's another area that's really important within energy use. Like I was saying, homes are responsible for 2/3 of global greenhouse gas emissions, but households are. But in India, homes are currently using about 25% of total electricity use, and residential electricity use in India has grown 50 times since 1971. In 2050, it's going to occupy 85% of India's floor space. But if you look at projections, and these again are just projections from different studies, including the IEA, so sort of global studies of the highest rank, you see that the numbers again are sort of all over the place. The projection can be anywhere between 5 times to 6 times, and we don't really know where the country is going to end up. So some of the work that we've been doing is to be able to build an empirical base to examine energy service transitions. And the reason we're doing that is, in the context of development, it's very hard to get accurate data. So it's hard to be able to trust the surveys and to trust the available data. And as researchers, we often go in and collect that data ourselves. And so what we've been doing is looking at both low-income housing and at large cities like Delhi to be able to examine what are the energy services and technologies that households demand. So if you're a household that is growing in income, that is urbanizing for the first time, maybe you're moving to the city for the first time, buying a house for the first time, what is the energy service, what is the energy technology that you buy first, right? What is prioritized within that context of development that is linked to energy use and climate change? And what are the kind of behaviors and drivers that underlie those energy service choices? So I'll give you a sense of the answer to some of that question. Now, the way we do this is if you look at studies of consumption in the US or in Europe, the basis by which households are ranked is by income, right? So you think about households in terms of what their income is, and you use that as a basis of saying this is a high earning household, this is a low earning household. We can't do that in a developing country context. We can't, because when you go into households and you ask them what is the amount of income that you make, you don't get an answer that you can trust. Often you don't get an answer at all, or they're all over the place. And I think this is a key difference in terms of how researchers manage the tensions of being able to work in these sort of transitioning contexts. Now, the way that we've dealt with this is that instead of thinking about income, we rank households on their ability to consume. And so we developed a model where we're working with an index which is based on the ownership of daily use assets. So things like smartphones, water purifiers, gas stoves, air conditioners, cars, TV. And these are things that when we go into the household, you can actually see. And so you know for sure whether a household has that or not. And we've used that to be able to rank households in terms of those that have a high ability to consume and as proxy for high income and have low ability to consume. So I'll give you an example of the types of services that are being demanded. So if you look at the x-axis here, you can see on 0 to 10 is basically households that are ranked low on this index, on this asset index. And then as you go higher up, you have households that are ranked higher on the asset index. And what I'm plotting is basically which are the appliances that households want and buy as their ability to consume increases. So if we just move from the left-hand side of the x-axis, you can see that the first thing. So look at the dark, look at the light blue actually. Okay, let's start by looking at the dark blue on top, which is the fan, and you can see that from 0 to 10 or 10 to 20. So early on on the asset index, you have households that are buying fans. It's the first thing that you buy. Then the next thing that you buy, and this kicks in around the 40 to 50th percentile, is a TV. So you actually buy a TV way before you buy a fridge. The fridge only kicks in at the 70th or the 80th percentile. It was interesting to be able to see that, right? Like there's a prioritization of entertainment over a fridge, which could be seen as a necessity in the way that households are urbanizing and what they are prioritizing, particularly in low-income homes. It wasn't intuitive in term, but that's what we find. We compare this with other countries, and this is not our work, it's taken from another paper. But you can see that, so you have Brazil, which is the light blue, India, which is the dark blue, and South Africa, which is the green. And you can see, so up top on the left quadrant is the mobile phone, and you can see that actually in India, the lower income households, acquire a mobile phone quite soon compared to, say, a place like South Africa. The right-hand side quadrant is the refrigerator, and here you see that in Brazil and South Africa, people buy a refrigerator early on, like as they have the ability to be able to buy one, they will get it. Whereas in India, a refrigerator just comes later, which is interesting for a very hot climate. On the TV, and this is similar to our results, you see that actually India does, even if you're very low income, you're going to buy a TV first. And whereas that's not the case in South Africa, you aim for a TV much later on, whereas there and you'd aim for a fridge before. So it's useful to see what priorities households give to the way in which they consume energy, and all of that adds up when you're talking about the scales of growth that you see in countries like India, but also in countries like South Africa and Brazil. It adds up to how, in a way, we're responding to the climate change issue. I'll make one last point before I end, and this is on thinking through determining what the drivers of electricity use are. Now, in our modeling work, and this is how global models, global climate models, global energy models, this is how most modeling is done on electricity use projections. We basically use a number of structural variables, right? So what are the appliances owned? What is the housing category? What are the number of households on the floor? That is the way in which you make projections about how much energy is going to be used. Sometimes socio-demographic variables are used. Very rarely are behavioral variables used, right? So by behavioral variables, I mean variables that allow you to model for the differences in the behaviors around energy consumption. And what we wanted to see was that, is there a way in which, like, what actually makes up energy use? If we had to project it accurately, is it accurate for us just to be able to say income and the building type is enough to project energy use? And so we were able to do a study where we had identical homes and over a period of time collect this data. And what we found was that if we looked at the electricity bill of these homes and we looked only at the material variables, so that is, things like the structure, the amount of area, which is what traditional energy models use, you could only explain 23% of the variation in consumption or in electricity use. If we use demographic variables, so things like class, caste, gender, education, you could explain much more of the energy consumption. And if you then included behavior, you could actually explain the largest amount of variance in energy consumption. And this is really, it's been very useful for us to be able to determine this statistically, because what we're able to say now is that, we're in a world where you're not just making projections about energy use based on the structure or the area or income, but rather around how people actually use energy. And that makes a difference in the way that modeling results are. We don't really model for this in mainstream. I wouldn't say mainstream energy models are accounting for behavior yet, but there is definitely a growing conversation about the need to be able to do that. Some examples of that are that households that have exactly the same appliances have very different electricity bills. And we were struck by that, right? Like if you have exactly the same appliances and you're a low-income home where there's not much variation, in terms of what you could do or not do, why is the bill so different? And in many ways, the answer for that is when we talk with these families, there are families that are turning their lights off and using the street light to be able to meet their electricity needs. And at the same complex, there are families that are, have lights that are on all the time. They have aspirations to buy large TVs. They complain about the lack of a neighborhood mall. There are families that have the fridge on, all the time. And there are other families that turn the fridge off, right? So there are families that are taking the fridge and using it as, more as a storage device, because culturally, the way to think about food is to favor fresh meals. And these are the kinds of nuances that don't make it through to our energy models. And so some of the work that we're doing is actually to be able to bring that role of behavior and culture into the discourse around energy and climate change, because actually it adds up and has a real role to play in we're thinking about climate mitigation options. This is similar work that we did in the Delhi region. And again, here, I just, want to show that the pattern is very similar. When you are, when you're the lower income decile, the first thing that you buy is a TV. And you buy a fridge next, but much later. And then because this was in the Delhi region, the appliance that you then begin to think about buying is a washing machine and a water purifier. And the sort of the next big question for us in this sort of energy issue is cooling. And we could do this in Delhi because the population is wealthy enough to think about owning air conditioners. But even then, so what you have here is you see that the orange line on top is the fan, and everyone owns a fan. The gray line is coolers, and it's a cooling system that's not. It's quite local, it's not so energy intensive. Most people start owning a cooler in the second or third decile. And then it's only the most wealthy. So you see the pink line only starts picking up around the 80th or 90th percentile. And that's when people start buying air conditioners. Now, air conditioners consume about 1,500 to 2,000 watts of electricity. A fan consumes about 60 to 100 watts of electricity. So you can see that as people get wealthier, as they buy more and more air conditioners, the demand on the system for energy consumption is going to be upped by an order of magnitude. And when you add that up, there is a real question about energy demand and the future of cooling. It's famously said by Lee Kuan Yew about Singapore that air conditioning changed the nature of civilization by making development possible in the tropics. We're now at a place where 1.1 billion people face risks from lack of cooling, and as extreme heat events get more and more mainstream, the number of air conditioner increases is already projected to be very high. In fact, the IEA says that the statistic is 10 new air conditioners every second will be sold for the next 30 years. So that's 10 ACs every second for the next 30 years. And so the future of cooling, in some sense, presents one of the most significant levers for us to shape global energy demand. And I'll show you this graph here, which actually.
Hey, Radhika. It's about time to transition to the panel. Are you ready to wrap up soon?
Yeah, I just have one slide left.
Perfect, thank you.
And so what you see here is that by the end of the century, air conditioning is going to be consume much more electricity than heating does, and again, this is important in the context of development, because where most of this energy consumption is going to come from is in developing countries that are managing this tension between climate and development. So I will end here. This is my last slide. In doing this work on the tensions between climate and development, our goal in some sense is to be able to identify where are the socio-technical tipping points, where are the points in these transitions that different countries are making, where you can shift the system towards being low carbon. And this is an example that is a reminder that it's possible to do this. So this is Easter Day Parade in New York City in 1900, and you can see that the primary mode of transport here is chariots. And then that same street, just a decade later, the primary mode of transportation became cars. And so, as a society where, we have done this before, and in many ways, the one of the key issues in the work we do on climate change mitigation now in the context of development is identifying these and being able to then implement them. So I'll stop there and thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Radhika, for that really interesting talk. I have a lot of questions, but in the interest of time, we're going to move straight to the panel. And so let me introduce our panel moderator and one of our discussants in the panel, Dr. Araba. Araba is a principal researcher with Research ICG Africa and a senior research scientist at the University of Washington. She studies many things, including the social and economic impacts of digitization, digital inclusion, and digital access, particularly in the African continent. So I'm so glad to welcome Dr. Araba to moderate this discussion with Dr. Radhika Khosla on research to practice in the developing world. So Araba, over to you, and please feel free to introduce yourself more to us before we begin the discussion.
Thank you very much. I think I'm going to go straight into the discussion so that we can make the most use of the time to get additional insights from Radhika, but also to hear from our viewers. So first of all, thank you, Radhika, for that fascinating insights into these issues of climate change, and especially in the developing country context. Thanks to all the participants who have joined us today. For me, this is also an unusual audience and an unusual topic. But I think there's some interaction with the work that I do, which I will come to in a moment. So we're going to have this panel in two parts. First, a brief discussion between myself and Radhika, and then we'll try to reserve as much time as we can for some Q&A. So please do drop your questions, comments, etc. in the chat while we're talking. The issues Radhika has raised, though they're coming from a different field, they are reminiscent of debates within the ICT4D community, which is the Information and Communication Technologies for Development community. And I imagine these are issues that the mechanism designed for social good community is also been grappling with. Things like the tension between technological development and inclusive growth, inclusive development. These questions about the relative importance or significance of demographic and behavioral variables on the outcomes of technology use, as well as the outcomes of the use of technologies that have energy consumption implications. And I think for me, maybe even more significantly, this question of where is the tipping point? When do we actually, see that growth, that big push that dramatically changes the trajectory on which and we are moving? So for the next 15 or so minutes, I want to invite us to consider three topics. One, what is the potential role of technology? And in this case, I'm thinking specifically about information and communication technologies in contributing to solving the climate-related challenges that Radhika has mentioned. Thinking of this, especially in view of the fact that your research has shown that households, even in low-income countries, even low-income households, prioritize entertainment over other, brown and white goods. And this is something that we have also observed in our work in digital access, is that even the uses to which people put those tools, which are seen as potentially having what one might call productive versus less productive uses, they tend to or at least prioritize entertainment-like or leisure-like uses of these technologies. But what does that mean, and how can technology play a role to solve these big issues? Secondly, we try to touch on the extractive nature of research and knowledge production. This is because we as researchers, that's our work, right? Our work is to extract knowledge, but how can we do this in a more mutually beneficial way with the communities in which we work? And then briefly, we'll touch on the pathways to from research to policy and the challenges that we also face there. So first, I want to just a few thoughts of my own on the role of technology, especially artificial intelligence in climate change and sustainable development. When I started studying in this field, the development community was preoccupied with broadcasting and mass media as the tools for development. When I started working in the area, the technological landscape had shifted to computers, internet, and then the mobile phones. And now there's another shift happening, which is towards AI, algorithms, machine learning, data-heavy technologies. And no doubt, many lives have been enriched by the affordances that these technologies provide. And there are a lot of people who believe that these technologies can play a role in resolving climate change problems. But after decades of ICT for development, I find that the majority of poor people are still poor. The majority of developing countries are still developing countries. And the majority of ICT for D projects have been essentially partial or full failures. And we are still asking the same questions about how technologies can be used to generate human development. Now, some reasons for these challenges in the digital realm are that digital access is still seriously limited in many parts of the world, even though they are important technologies for families. Not just because they don't have the technology, that they may not have the most modern versions of those technologies. So everybody has a cell phone, but they may not have a smartphone, which is where everything is moving towards. So they can't keep up with the technological changes either. Large proportions of those who do have access lack the financial means, the skills, or the quality of connectivity to make use of the technologies to their full extent. And oftentimes the broader ecosystem that needs to be in place for technology to have its impact is missing. There's also the fact that non-profit, for-profit organizations are expected to be the ones that were expected to eventually see low-income populations as viable markets.
I'm really sorry. It seems like maybe your internet is cutting out. It may help to turn off your camera feed so we just get audio. Sorry. You keep freezing and we keep losing audio and video for you. It may help to turn off your video so we just get your audio, and that will hopefully work.
Great, let me do that. Excellent. Okay.
Sorry.
So as I was asking Radhika, what role do you think digital technologies can play in addressing climate change in a sustainable manner? And how can we avoid repeating the mistakes of the past in not considering the limits of technology?
Thanks, Araba, and I'd love to talk to you more about this and sort of have a chance to hear more about your examples. I mean, I'll be brief, and I think if we stay with the with the purview of households, then demand response, which is when you can use smart meters, so use digital technologies, information technologies that are in your tied with your appliances, and also so they speak both to your appliances and also speak to the grid and to the electricity grid, and can communicate between the electricity grid and your needs in your household. That is, in some sense, that's the frontier of where we're headed. Now, whether that sort of technological shift alone is going to take care of all the the loopholes and the mistakes of the past, I don't think so. And I think that is true in sort of the work we've been doing, and some of the examples that I've been showing are using that same point, which is to say that technologies alone are just not enough. It's how we use those technologies, and similarly, sort of if we're in the world where we're modeling, then how do we model the use of those technologies? Sort of assuming that everyone uses technologies in the same way, or everyone has equal access to technologies, is just not an accurate representation. And so I think building that kind of nuance and texture into this discussion is important. And so we've been trying to do that. But I'd say the short answer is demand side management, but one that allows and takes care of this idea of access and equal access for everyone.
Thanks, Radhika. Secondly, noting that many careers, including academic careers, are built on the premise of information and communication technologies for development. And with all the explorations going on in the developing countries in particular, have become experimental grounds for students, for professors, for practitioners, as we try to understand the potential and the limits of technology. Unfortunately, it's debatable how much our work actually benefits the communities we do our research in the long term, after we have left to write our reports, our journal articles, books, or build our prototypes. So what do you think are the reasons for this continued disconnect and for the extractive nature of research? And how do you think it affects the sustainability of our outcomes?
Yeah, I mean, I think we can have a whole session on that topic, right? In some sense, why it happens is I mean, there's a sort of very complicated piece around the rewards of academic life and what it merits in terms of publications versus actually the impact on communities. But I think what is important is, in some sense, where are the examples of how academic output can actually be beneficial to communities, right? And how can academic output be able to inform policy? So I think, in the work that we do with data collection and publishing it academically, for us, there's like an equal push to be able to inform local and work with, in partnership with, and co-produce knowledge with local level communities or the stakeholders who are in power there through government or sort of non-governmental organizations. And I think that's the way to break that cycle that you're talking about, Araba, because that cycle is very entrenched, right? In many ways, you have this sort of parachuting of researchers coming in, taking the knowledge they need, and then leaving. And then actually, there are so many examples where researchers are not even at the site; they're not even in situ, right? You're actually producing knowledge by not even being in the place that you're talking about. And so I think what we really need to look to and move towards are the better and best practices around how not to do that.
Thank you. I think you may have actually preempted the next question I was going to ask, and a question that I'm seeing in the chat. So I'm going to hand over to Irene now so that we can at least have 5 minutes for audience reaction.
Yes, of course. And I was going to comment the same thing, that Radhika, I think you're starting to touch on this question that came up in the chat. And I'm actually going to pose this question to both of you, Radhika and Araba. And the question is fairly long, but let me read it out to you. One of the core issues, it seems, is that in AI system, fairness continues to be a ubiquitous principle, but this fairness is in quotation marks. If we are actually going to leverage technology in ways that we support different types of populations, I feel we need to prioritize justice in the design, development, and management of these systems. And so the question is, how can we redefine how we approach AI systems, especially those related to AI for social good or sustainable development goals that center justice? What are the approaches that we can explore further? One example could be participatory action research.
Yeah, should we have Araba go first, maybe?
Okay. Yeah, I think this is one of the, maybe defining questions of our time as we try to see how AI is going to influence populations at large. For me, the issue of defining justice is itself as challenging as what it means to define fairness. And so I think one of the first things we need to do is to figure out what we mean when we say justice, and whether there need to be contextual definitions of justice. A lot of the debates, the conversation, the frameworks that are emerging to govern AI are actually coming from the Western world. And so in answer to this question, I think one of the things that we could do is to try to include more of the voices of leaders and communities in developing countries in that conversation, so that non-Western notions of justice and fairness are also incorporated into those systems. Thanks.
I'll just add to that by saying absolutely agree, and not just non-Western ideas of justice, but also sort of non-Western and local, indigenous, sort of means in which practices evolve, right? So it's not just about, so sort of what is considered a mainstream practice. Our ideas of those practices are actually quite narrowly defined by researchers in certain sort of parts of the world, usually Western parts of the world. But I think it's not just sort of, how we think about justice, but how we think about what is normal practice, what is everyday practice, whether that is around energy consumption or other aspects of culture. Sort of drawing that in and actually learning from local communities and co-producing, as I was talking about earlier, is really key to that, but also recognizing that there isn't something ubiquitous here. There is so much local level information, and each of that needs to be drawn out for the local level. And you can learn across cultures, as we always do, but also there is a lot to be determined in terms of what is relevant for a particular area.
I'll just add very briefly that universal question for me is take a step back and examine your food, or for that assumes that the technology can be used in that way. And I think you should always see what the systems are that are producing the technology to determine whether or not the technology can be used in quotes for good or for development.
Great, thank you so much. We lost you for a little bit of that, Araba, but we were able to catch the end. So thank you for that sharing. I'm going to take the liberty here and allow us time for one or two more questions, since we haven't had that much Q&A, and we'll go into the break after those questions. So if you have any questions, please feel free to drop it in the chat. I'm going to ask one of my own. I was wondering, both of you started touching on this, but can you give examples in your own work of how you address this tension, this incentive in research to kind of parachute, go in and find the interesting knowledge, and how do we ensure that we're answering the community's questions rather than our own? How do we ensure that we're addressing the problem in the long run and not just in the moment that we're there conducting the research?
Not easily. And I can't say I have been necessarily successful yet in any of this effort in my 15 or so years working in research and academia. But what I have been trying to do recently, and I'm beginning to see some fruits over the last 7 or so years, is to build lasting relationships in the field and to return to those places for the research that I do. So rather than choosing a different location every time you have a research project, I try to make that community sort of part of my research agenda, but make my research agenda also their research agenda, and sort of focus on the issues that they are interested in. So I have a couple of projects now where I'm working in a community that I actually have a 10-year relationship with. I used to take students there on a study abroad program. I took them to the same place every year for 7 years. So that relationship developed over time. And then when I had the opportunity to do a research project with something, I had not much resources, but significant enough to do a project on the ground. I went to that community and said, I have some money to do some research. We want to do something in your community. What sort of research can we do here? What would be most helpful to you? We have this broad agenda of gender equality, digital equality, STEM education, but that was the broad the framework. And then together with them, we developed a project, and we're starting to work on it now. So in that sense, I feel that at least the community knows that I have been committed to them over time. And so they're willing to also participate in this effort because it's hopefully mutually beneficial to them as well. And so I think that's just an example of the sort of thing that one could do. It's not easy, and it doesn't fit the timeline of our research projects and our professional evaluations and research grant funding and so on. But if we could get the institutions to change as well to reward this type of research, I think we would go a long way to changing the parachute research phenomenon.
I love that. Thank you, Arapa. And Radhika, do you want to add anything to that question?
Just to sort of echo the importance of relationships, and also just say that you have to take it slow. Like there is no sort of fast track here in some sense. Really building trust and time and credibility with the communities that we're trying to understand and work with, and along with that, I'd say I find that engaging with policy is another way in which to have a lasting impact. And informing policy, particularly in contexts where actually, research and evidence is limited. I think we actually have a role and a responsibility in terms of not only, sort of helping build some of that evidence, but then also having that evidence be used in a way that is helpful for that community through policymakers.
Great, thank you so much, both of you. And I'm going to throw in one last question that kind of riffs off the one I see in the chat. In 1 minute or less, do you have an exhortation or encouragement for our listeners for what can they do? And so there's a question in the chat, well, what do I do as a white American and all the privilege that carries? What does that mean for entering into these developing world questions? Also for the students who might be nervous about the amount of time and energy that seems to need to be invested to do this really joint research with communities. Where can our listeners start?
Oh boy, only 1 minute. I think, honestly, trying to let go of your stance as a researcher who knows, and giving over the ownership of the research and even the design of the research and the execution of the research to the communities you're doing the work in is one of the best ways to find your place in that scenario. So rather than going in with your research and then having the community try and find its place in it, do it the other way around and see what happens. Now, again, I have to be honest, it doesn't always work. It doesn't always work out, but you have to try and start that way. And the more you do it, the more you learn how to take that stance, and the more, I think, success you'll have over time in doing this kind of work, where you relinquish your position as the external Western researcher who knows. And I say this as someone who haven't spent so much time in the West. I'm almost seen as a Westerner when I go back home. And so I also have to try and take that stance myself when I go into communities.
Thank you so much, Radhika. Radhika?
I'll be quick. I'd say no matter what it is that you're trying to research, it will take time and effort, and there isn't anything to be afraid of with regarding that. It's actually the reward is in that effort, and so just to embrace that. And second, I'd say I'd say it's important to recognize one's role and the positionality around that, and it's key, but I would not make it a burden. I think what's important is that there's genuine interest and in wanting to understand and contribute to a place and an issue, and that should be the driving force, not so much really the particular burden of identity that one can carry. I would urge to be free of that a little bit, so that the focus can be on the work. Some of the best scholars I've seen of art don't come from the places that they're working on, and there is value to that, because there's a different perspective that comes from that, which we also need.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Radhika and Araba, and all our listeners for being here today. I just want to add my own exhortation that I think EAAMO and MD4SG are trying to do this kind of community-driven work in partnership with those who we are conducting our research with. And so I think there's space for this, and I've seen this in my own work, that when you genuinely care about a community and you go in with a researcher mindset, you're able to have impact in that community. And then even though it's non-standard in academia, we also are recognized for that in the academic space. So just an exhortation that I think this is a new, in many ways, way of doing research for many people, but I think everyone sees the value in it. Great. Well, thank you so much. We are quite over time, so I'm going to wrap us up now. We have a 6-minute break, and we're going to transition back at 15 past the hour to our next policy and practice panel on refugee resettlement, which I'm very excited for. So thank you very much, everyone. See you in 6 minutes.
Thank you.
Beatrice, thank you so much, Beatrice. Pat, also thank you so much. I think that's the end of the time for today, but we'll see you tomorrow. Bye. And Andrew, I think Rodolfo is here, so if we can maybe just set that up and do a sound check.
Yep. Hey. Sounds great. Anyone that hasn't changed their name yet, from session chair or interpreter or presenter, if you could do so now by clicking the participants button and then the more by your name, please.
Hello, everyone.
Hi.
How are you?
So far, so good. Woke up at 4 a.m. for some reason, but we're here.
Awesome. So I want to know the panelists. I think Alicia is here, Paulina, and I think Yukai.
Hi, how are you?
Hi, Yukai, how are you?
Good, thank you. How are you? Nice meeting you as well.
Yeah. And Richard, I think, is Richard here?
Yep, I'm here.
Hi, hello, Richard.
Hi there.
See you. So I'm Tilsa. I will be chairing the session. And actually, I'm very excited to learn from all of you. So there are many things that I don't know, and you are the experts. And so maybe I will do many questions, maybe silly questions.
That's good.
Perfecto, está funcionando.
So we've got 6 minutes to be quiet and to look at each other.
I'll make some small talk in the 3 minutes we're waiting. It's good to see you, Alicia. It's so nice.
Yeah,
to
you too.
Yeah, I'm so excited for this panel. I've been advertising it to all my students, so I hope a lot of them come.
Yeah, Alex actually kind of wound me into this. Yeah.
Wonderful. Have you all had the chance to meet each other?
No.
No, not yet.
Well, I'm sure we have time for introductions in the actual panel, but I don't know how
Just
to.
been randomly picked from around the globe to come together. Because where's the actual base for this conference? What country is it actually being organized in?
Yeah, the 3 program chairs are in the US. And so I guess if we had to have a location base, it would be in the US. I'm on the West Coast, and my co-organizers are on the West Coast and East Coast, so kind of all over. Yeah.
Yeah, because I was referred by an Oxford professor to a University of New South Wales professor, and I've been looking at the time of things. The person I've been talking to has gone to bed.
Yes. Yeah, Matt is in Australia, and so he's not able to join us. I think it's some crazy thing like 2 or 3 a.m. for him right now.
So I've now got my staff team sort of getting ready to watch the live streams. That should be quite good for them.
Sorry, I'm a bit distracted by some logistical things. Good. I think some of our participants might be over on the Gather space. Anna, have you gone over to? Okay, great. So Anna's gone around and told people to come back over. So
I'm gonna go tell people to come now. If you want to start in a minute or so.
Great. So we can wait a minute until people start coming back. Thank you, Anna. And Richard, I'm gathering from your accent, are you based in the UK?
Yeah, just there to a city called Bristol.
Bristol, wonderful. Yeah. Heard of it, but not been there.
No, it's quite pretty. It's got history and quite a future-looking vision as well.
Great. There's a question, can we invite people who are not registered who are interested in listening to this panel? I'm going to throw that to my co-organizers. Do we have a live stream available somewhere?
We do have a live stream. I'll Andrew, do we have a link to the? I don't know if Andrew's there, but I'll post it. There is a live stream.
Great. So if you want for any of your colleagues, friends to be able to watch this session, you can pass the link along to them.
Do you want me to just put it in the chat here for everyone?
Yeah, I think so.
Great.
When do I start? Sorry.
Yeah, I think Anna is almost back and we're starting to see people come in. So I'll pass it over to you when we start.
Okay, great. Nice meeting you.
Yes.
Yes, are you back in Peru?
I am.
Oh. Did you just reach like a couple of days ago?
Yes. So I came on Sunday. Yeah, Sunday.
Oof.
Going back and there, back and there.
Okay, so I see people are coming back. So why don't we go ahead and get started? So Christian and Tilsa, I'll hand it to the two of you.
Awesome. Thank you, Irene. Welcome again to this EAAMO conference. Today we have the policy and practice panel about refugees and asylees. My name is Tilsa Ore. I am actually now connecting from Lima, Peru. And it's a pleasure to have you all here. And we are gonna learn from a diverse group of practitioners who have experience working with refugees and asylees. And actually today also it's a special day to talk about refugees and asylees since the Nobel Prize in Literature was awarded to the novelist Abdul Razak Gurnah, who is a Tanzanian national, and actually he is a refugee himself in England, and most of his literature also talk about the effects of colonialism and the fate of the refugee. So I think it's a nice day also to talk about and to know more about this awesome topic. Myself, I declare myself not to know much about the topic, so I will also try to learn a lot from our four guests. And before we start, I would like to have maybe some context of what is the problem about the refugees and asylees. And according to the UN Refugee Agency, at least 82.4 million people around the world have been forced to flee their homes. And this, of course, as a result of conflict, violence, human rights violations, and persecution. Among them, like almost 25% of these people are refugees, and half of these people are under the age of 18. So lots of young people there. So let me introduce our guests. So we have Yukai Kaidea. Yukai is a junior researcher at the Institute of Life Course Health Research in Stellenbosch University. Sorry for my broken English. She's also center manager at the Institute's Massive Fulisand Research Center, and she worked for almost a decade at senior management level at the Trauma Center for Survivors of Torture and Violence. Part of her responsibilities included providing psychosocial support to refugees and asylum seekers. Yukai graduated from University of Cape Town and holds a master's degree in social sciences and clinical social work practice. Welcome, Yukai. We also have, hey, we also have Paulina Vera. Paulina supervises the, Paulina supervises the George Washington Law Immigration Clinic students and provides legal representation to asylum seekers and respondents facing deportation in immigration court. She is also a professorial lecturer in law and has previously taught immigration law. Well, Paulina previously served as the only immigration staff attorney at the Maryland-based nonprofit CASA. And well, she had lots of experience about dealing with clients that have these problems with deportation. And well, she graduated from George Washington University Law School, where also she got a bachelor in international studies. She's originally from Tucson, Arizona, and she's a proud daughter of 2 immigrants. Hello, Paulina. We also have Richard Thigpenny. He's Chief Innovation Officer at the Ashley Community and Housing, ACH, where he leads the organization's research and consultancy work alongside the Rethinking Refugee Agenda. He has been working with refugee communities since 2004, leading the development of innovative integration services that create opportunities for individuals to lead independent and ambitious lives in the UK. Richard leads the ACH campaign to create systemic change to redefine, recenter, and rebuild the integration process to end the cycle of poverty of newly arrived communities. Welcome, Richard.
Welcome.
Also, we have Alicia Remp. Alicia joined the HIAS, which is the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, as Senior Director for Resettlement and Integration in 2019. HIAS is an institution that helped for more than 100 years to refugees and to resettle them in safety, reuniting families who have been separated and helping them build new lives in safety and freedom. So hello, Alicia, how are you? I think she's there. Okay, so let's start from the basics. I think, although there are many people that may know the topic, I think there are some people like me that need some immigration law 101. So Paulina, are you there? How are you? Paulina, I was wondering if you can explain us from the legal perspective, what is the difference between a refugee and asylee in terms of legal protection?
Sure. So both refugees and asylees into the United States, right? Because I practice in Washington, D.C., and I represent immigrants from D.C., Maryland, and Virginia. Under our system, refugees and asylees are essentially the same, just the key difference is where they're applying for protection from. And so refugees are seeking protection, but doing most of their process from outside of the United States, whereas asylees, who I mainly represent, are doing the process from inside of the United States. But both of these categories of folks are fleeing something, right? They are scared to return to their country. And so the definition that we have under our domestic law here in the United States that was adopted from international law is that the person faced persecution in the past, or they have a well-founded fear of future persecution. And that persecution is tied to or on account of one of the 5 protected grounds. So that's race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. So the membership in a particular social group is kind of an amorphous category. There's no definition of what constitutes a particular social group in our Immigration Nationality Act, which is the fundamental base of our immigration law here in the United States. So much of what we know about that does come from case law. So cases that come from the Supreme Court, circuit courts, or the Board of Immigration Appeals, which is an appellate court that we have in our immigration system. And so that can constitute things like gender. As you might have noticed, gender was not listed in the protected grounds. That might constitute folks, members of the LGBTQ community. We've had clients who have suffered from various mental illnesses. We right now have a client who is paranoid schizophrenic. And so we are advancing her asylum claim under their particular social group. So both categories of folks, refugees and asylees, are fearing something back in their home country, again, on account of one of these things. The key difference being where they're applying for protection and also which agencies they're going to interact with as well. So like I said, I'll speak more so to the asylee context because that's really what I work on. But in the United States, some folks go through what's called the affirmative process of asylum. So they have an interview with an officer from our immigration agency, USCIS. And that's a non-adversarial setting. We have an asylum office right here in Arlington, Virginia, and the asylum applicant will have an interview. If they're successful, wonderful, they get asylum. They're not successful, then they move to the defensive posture, which is in front of the immigration judge. Or some folks think, the people coming in from the southern border, they may start in front of the immigration judge. And so that's a defensive posture. That is, there is a government attorney who's seeking to deport the person in proceedings. There's an immigration judge. There's the asylum applicant themselves. And if they're lucky, because our system does not provide for counsel to be appointed, they may have an attorney that represents them as well. And so that's really, I do both the affirmative process and the defensive process. And so I'm happy to talk about more of what that looks like on a day-to-day basis, but that's generally the difference between the two.
Well, thank you very much. And what are the main challenges your clients face when they are facing deportation?
Sure. So there's a lot of things, right? First of all, the system is intentionally made to be very confusing. And so there's a lot of different requirements that have to be met. I kind of just gave a broad overview of what asylum is, but each of those words that I just said, persecution, well-founded fear, on account of, political opinion, et cetera, those all have their own legal definitions that have to be met. And so it's a lot of, it's very complicated, right, to navigate the system. And the way to put forth the best defense, right, is with evidence, but that can be tricky as well, right? Because a person's testimony alone should be sufficient. However, with many adjudicators, unfortunately, we see that they want more. They want evidence to corroborate what they're saying, but people are fleeing their country, right? So they might not think, oh, let me bring the note that the gang member wrote to me to threaten my life. They don't think to bring these things necessarily. And so we do have a challenge in trying to get evidence sometimes. That might mean reaching out to someone in home country, getting people to write letters if they have knowledge of what happened. But obviously, right, that can be difficult to like get the originals here to make that happen. Maybe people don't have knowledge. So evidence, I would say, is one thing that's very difficult. Something else that's difficult is the long processing times. So right now I have clients that we submitted their asylum applications to the asylum office in 2017. They still have not had an interview. Wow. So they have been waiting that time. And that's not even the worst. In our immigration court system in the United States, we are over 1 million cases in deportation proceedings nationwide. And so right now, it's very common for people to not even have hearings until I think my latest client is scheduled in 2024. So we're getting into 2024, 2025. I actually have a client whose hearing's finally going to be this December. She's been in proceedings since 2013 and has not had a hearing for her asylum case. So the very long wait times put people in a limbo process. That causes them a lot of, rightfully so, a lot of anxiety, a lot of stress, while they have to think about what the decision might be on their case and if they're going to be able to obtain protection here in the United States. And also, right, life happens during that time. People get jobs here, they study, they have kids who are then US citizens and they have mixed status families, they might get married. And so their life goes on, right? But they're just waiting and waiting and waiting until they are finally able to get that decision. So that's also very challenging as well. And it's unfortunate, right? Because my clients often call me and ask for updates. And often the update is, there is no update. We just have to wait. And that's a huge failing of our system. So I would say those are there are plenty. I could talk for hours about the challenges of asylum seekers face, but I think those are two of some of the biggest ones that we see.
So you mentioned that there are these huge time that they have to wait just wait. So I was wondering, is this just because there is a lot of bureaucracy involved in this, or it's just about the numbers that you get for I don't know, to process all filings?
I would say it's a number of things. Definitely the system is overburdened. There is just not enough resources dedicated to the adjudication side of things. Plenty of funding from Congress does go to the enforcement side of things. And so that's one thing, right? We just flat out need more resources, more adjudicators in the court system, more clerks, more things like that, right? That can help with the processing of cases. But even beyond that, it's just like, I would say it's an over eagerness to place people in proceedings to begin with, right? I think that there's a lot to be said for like this concept called prosecutorial discretion, right? In the criminal context in the United States, prosecutors can decide, we're just not even gonna put folks in the system to begin with. And that's because we're balancing the resources that we have. Well, we have a similar concept in the immigration court system. And because our system is so politicized and a lot of the agencies are under the executive branch, i.e. the president is the top, we often see we sort of see like prosecutorial discretion go like this. Like in the last administration, it really was not a thing. Now it's being brought back under the Biden administration. But that's something else too, is even like what decisions are we making about like who should be in proceedings, and should we be placing so many people in proceedings to begin with? And so because of that, like our system is really overburdened at the moment. And that's, why we're seeing these tremendous backlogs. And that extends for not even just the asylum, we're talking about asylum today, but that extends to like family-based petitions, U visas, which I also do, which are for victims of crimes here in the United States. And some of those are subject to numerical caps in a way that asylum is not, but still there's something to be said, right, about across the board, we see tremendous backlogs in our immigration system.
Okay. And what are the criteria, if any, that determine whether an asylum seeker in an adversarial setting is granted legal counsel?
Sorry, I'm not sure I quite understand your question. Could you repeat that?
Yeah, so I was wondering if there is what kind of criteria do you have to determine whether an asylee is granted legal counsel?
Sure. So you mean like what determines if I take on a case or not?
Yes.
Okay. So, I mean, a number of things. Like I said, I laid out some of the requirements, right? To how to have a successful asylum claim. And so when I do a consultation, I'm really just hearing their story first and foremost, right? I ask, are you afraid to go back to your country and why? And I let people tell me, right? And then I ask follow-up questions and I start to see, right, okay, what happened to them in their home country? Does that rise to the level of persecution via the legal definitions that we have? I talk to them about types of evidence that they may have. And I mean, it's also a sense of credibility is a huge thing in our system. Adjudicator can find someone credible or not credible, and to be found not credible is very, very hard to overturn. It makes it really difficult for someone to continue with their case. And so it's also it's from experience, right? Getting a sense of the credibility of someone's case. If there's inconsistencies in their story, can those be explained? Why are there inconsistencies, right? Is it because they face trauma? And a lot of people with, I'm not a doctor and I have no medical background, right? But a lot of people that have this past trauma do manifest it in that they forget things, they may be inconsistent in their story, things might not be lining up. And so, right, sort of seeing like, does that make sense? And then just seeing if they meet some of the procedural like elements too. Like, for example, in the United States, you have to apply for asylum within 1 year of arriving to the United States. There are some exceptions to that rule, but seeing if someone even that's like passes like that first hurdle, right? Or if there's a way to argue why that did not happen. So there's a lot of and I'm thankful here at the law school that we're able to provide those services on a pro bono basis. That's another thing is, you know, a lot of these pro bono legal organizations, nonprofits are really overburdened as well, just because of the sheer numbers of people seeking relief. And so it makes me happy that the cases that we are able to take on, we also are backed by the law school and able to dedicate the resources that we need to hopefully have a successful asylum claim. So I hope that answers your question.
Great. Yes, thank you, Paulina. And actually, you were talking about some important issue here that has to be with trauma. And we have Yukai here that works in a trauma center. So Yukai, I suppose that this happens, but what are some challenges refugees and asylees face integrating in South Africa? And I was wondering also what kind of, I don't know, from your perspective, how difficult it is for refugees that you work with to integrate in the society in South Africa?
Thank you so much, Chelsea. You're actually spot on. So just to give some background info, the way a refugee comes into South Africa, when they get to the point of entry, they are interviewed. And then unlike other African countries whereby there's a refugee camp where the refugees are taken and then they are taught the local language and taught how to earn an income, when refugees come into South Africa, they apply for asylum. So they're called asylum seekers. So once they apply for asylum seeker permit, they are then expected to live with family or friends. If they don't have any family or friends in South Africa, they're then referred to UNHCR or any of the local NGOs for them to find shelter. But then the expectation is now put on them to settle by themselves. So that then speaks to the integration. So they find it very difficult for them to integrate into the communities because number one, they don't know the language. Number two, when they have an asylum seeker permit, it's short term. So sometimes it's for 4 to 6 months and there's no employer who would want to employ someone who can't speak the language or who only has a short term permit. So it's very difficult for them to find employment. And then the community itself, like the locals, already it's an communities that are struggling with poverty. So now you've got foreign nationals who are coming into your society and you already have very few resources and they also need the resources themselves. So in South Africa, we really struggle with xenophobic attacks. I think the main ones was in 2008, 2015, and 2018. And what would result in that is that they would get thrown out of their homes, lose whatever property that they would have bought. And most of them would then have to seek refuge at the police stations. So at the trauma center, we would now work with the refugees that would come to us needing counseling. So what we normally would do is a background assessment for us to learn, okay, what's your background? Most of the refugees in South Africa, they are from Congo, Burundi, Somalia. So you do the background check, you hear the stories that they've gone through. And as a counselor, your first thing is how can I help them to deal with the trauma? But what you realize is that they only speak about their trauma for the first session when you're doing the background check. For the second session, and sometimes you see refugees for up to 20 sessions, it's always about the safety and their needs for shelter, food, accommodation, or us being able to provide them with protection because they're not safe in their communities. So it's very difficult as people who are providing psychosocial support because most of the time you end up then working with law firms like what Paulina was saying now, whereby you now need to look for ways of providing protection, ways of ensuring that they get medical help, and also just them getting the basic needs like employment. But it's very, very difficult if they are on an asylum seeker permit. And just like what Paulina was explaining, it's the same in South Africa that you find someone on an asylum seeker permit for more than 10 years. And if you're on an asylum seeker permit, you have to go back to the entry point for you to renew your permit. So let's say you came through one of our border posts in Limpopo, which is maybe 3,000 kilometers away from where you are staying. Every 6 months, you have to return back to renew your permit. And if you're not working, that's very difficult. So you end up having refugees that are undocumented. And if you are undocumented, it's very difficult for you to get help. So I think those are some of the challenges that are there.
I see. And at the trauma center, you must have encountered some incredible people. Is there a story that stands out that you would like to share?
Yes, there is one, but again, I will try to generalize this as much as possible because of confidentiality issues. But I think it was in 2017, I was called out and was being told that there is a refugee was in distress in the reception area. So I went, I met with a, long story short, the asylum seeker permit had been cancelled because she didn't qualify for her refugee status. So when we then sat down with her and we went to a law firm with the lawyer, what we found out was that when she was interviewed by a male interviewer, and number two, the interpreter didn't really explain the questions properly. And what she had experienced was sexual violence in a country of origin. So when she was now being asked all these questions in a language that she wasn't really comfortable with, and by a male interviewer, she didn't speak up about the sexual violence. And because of that, she ended up not sharing her story. And the story that she shared, which was not true, didn't meet the criteria for her to become a refugee. So she was now told that her application was unsuccessful and she had to return back to a country of origin. So when she came to us, was in distress because she couldn't go back to a country of origin due to the violence that she had experienced. So what we had to do was to provide her with psychosocial support, but also work in collaboration with the law firm. A year later, we were able to get her back into the asylum seeker role. And then after a while, she did get a refugee status. And I think in 2019, she fell pregnant. She had twins. One of the twins, she named her after me. And then the other twin, she named her after the lawyer as a way of saying thank you. So those are some of the stories. The other one, sorry, I'll just share two. The other one that comes to mind, I was called out because there was a refugee who was refusing to go and get help at the hospital. So I went and spoke to the refugee. And when he found out that I was not a South African, I was a Zimbabwean, he was more at ease to speak to me. So we spoke and he agreed to go to hospital. The reason why she was refusing to go with a South African national was because of the xenophobic attacks that he was experiencing in the communities where he lived. When we got to the hospital and he realized that he needed to be admitted, he got so angry that he wanted to attack me. If it wasn't for my colleague, I would have been attacked. And that also goes to show some of the mental health challenges that the refugees end up facing because of what they're going through. Sorry.
Thank you, Yuka, for sharing that. It seems that there are a lot of barriers, not only language, but also cultural barriers that may prevent people to get the help they need. As you mentioned, and Paulina, and you mentioned, one of the main problems that refugees have is that they lack of opportunities for employment, for example, due to all this processing time that they have. And we have here Richard and Alicia that works in institutions that actually aim to help people to resettle and to to be introduced into the labor market in the communities. So Richard, what would you say are the characteristics of an ideal community for integrating refugees?
This is quite an interesting question because it sort of starts to classify refugees as a homogenous, just a oneness. So with ACH, we work with individuals from over 40 different countries of origin. And what we've been looking at is actually how we provide a very personalized support mechanism for each of those refugees and the needs that they present with. So in a city like Bristol, where I am, then there's, in the background, there's actual overemployment in the city. So there's actually a massive demand currently for individuals, and there's a reasonable amount of actual language training. The UK, despite all of the press in that, is reasonably prosperous. So the problem that we find is the fact that sometimes it can be too easy to get people into jobs, which is very good in the short term. So it meets the needs of individuals, especially if they've come through the asylum process, where they've been sort of traumatized through that process. So they can easily move into employment on a type of work where you only need to have the language capability equivalent to about a 10 or 11-year-old English person. But it's the next stage, and that's what we've been looking at, is with the work that we do every year, we work with close to 2,500 individuals. So over a 10-year span, that's about 25,000 people, which is the size of a small market town in the UK. And a small market town in the UK will have mixed employment offers. It will have everybody from unemployed through to doctors. So what we've been looking at is actually with the charter on the 1951 Charter on refugees should not be disadvantaged in relation to the native population. So where we have a native population that has a median salary of around about £26,000 per year, that's our target. Whereas the prime driver in the system is for people to get any job, and our entry-level jobs in the UK are paid at a level that's 60% of the median salary, and in terms of Europe, that's classified as poverty. Mm-hmm. So the work that we've been looking at, and the actual what drives the way we work, is how do we ensure that those that we work with are able to not just move straight into poverty and achieve an employment goal, but are able to progress up to that median salary. So we've used, in terms of the community, what we've been looking at is the fact that there's always going to be a shortage of those there to provide language training or the necessary support for that development. So we've invested quite a bit of time into the technology to work with that. So we've been working with a French partner around an AI chatbot, which replicates the social networks that you would hope to have if you were going into a job such as a computer-based or digital-based employment. We've been looking at gamification approaches so that actually the people that we're working with can be self-sufficient in their integration rather than being dependent all of the time on agencies. So that gamification approach is looking at how they can acquire sort of civilians and community information and actually establish within the cities themselves. Mm. We've also been looking at sort of how we work and secure the data to evidence change so that we can actually work in more broadly with a wider group of organizations.
Sure. And Richard, how long it would take to a refugee to be employed to something that it's, matches his or her skills in the UK?
Follow the traditional humanitarian approach. It's very likely to be never, unless you're picked up by a group that's got a specific interest and a specific set of links. There's been a big move over recent years to develop employment pathways into the likes of the NHS. So the inhibiting factor is the level of of English a lot of the time. So in terms of state funding, the level of English that you can acquire free at source is a level 2, which is a sort of medium grade for a 16-year-old.
Mm-hmm.
Your career type jobs in the civil service require the sort of skill set that you would get, say, as an 18-year-old individual.
Mm-hmm.
So again, that increased vocabulary. And then to go on to those main trades, you're looking at, again, that sort of degree level English. So the route way using the traditional free English in the UK could take between 5 and 10 years to get to the level of the 16-year-olds. So one of the things that we're advocating very much for is developing the digital skills to access English language training online and work it that way, because the resources there will allow a much faster route way. So that's especially if you're working with individuals who've come from rural backgrounds where they've only had primary education, you've got the start points quite low. Where we're working, say, with an Iranian professor who's fled because of persecution, the level of English and the level of resilience could be a lot greater, whether they choose to go back to original careers. Another thing, because of the persecution itself and family links. So where somebody's already at that professional level, it's much quicker. And what's required then more is around building the networks that allow them to get access to the opportunities, and that will depend city by city.
Sure, that's pretty important. Alicia, I was wondering how would be the things in the US in terms of characteristics of a community for integrating refugees in an easy way, and also about employment opportunities. Is it very hard, and how HIAS is helping them?
So I think it'll be helpful to provide some background. So HIAS works in 18 different locations. And so at the start of this, we're making decisions about where people should be resettled within our network. So to one of the questions there, we use an algorithm for placement optimization. It's called Annie. It's a tool, and we use it as a decision support tool. So we can always override the recommendation, having perhaps more information about a site, but it helps us first and foremost place optimally. And then and these are, just to make the distinction between what Paulina was speaking about, these are refugees with status, so are coming in with some benefits attached to their journey. So when refugees end up at the sites, there's a whole set of services that start to come into play. And as Richard talked about, the one thing about refugees is there's a huge variety in who you're serving, and not only their English language capacity, but what their home language is, education levels, and so on. And so there's so much tailoring that goes on to support refugees. And the research is good. In terms of labor force participation, wage rates increasing over time. But I know we could shorten the journey to integration by years and years if we did things better and more tailored to the needs of clients. So know that in the US, because the stipends are so low from the federal government, people have to go into survival jobs. And at 90 days, for example, about 45% of clients are working. So just like huge, fast entrance into life in the US. But what that does is it cuts off continued learning. And so oftentimes they're working not just one job, but 2 jobs. And so the time they have to dedicate to learning English and skilling up is really minimal. So that's kind of one major effort that we're undertaking, is the career pathways idea. And we've spent a lot of time this past year focusing on digital literacy skills and how to support clients' kind of baseline foundational skills that are so important for every job and for navigating communities. And then additionally, trying to be creative about English language instruction. It's a really outdated model here in the US. It requires you to attend classes in person and not the right selection of classes. So really trying to go to some more online opportunities and more tailored to the needs of clients. So that's, Richard, at another time, I'd like to follow up with you on your project you described.
Yeah, it'd be good to do that.
Yeah, but how it works community by community is really, it's a local effort. So you have clients might be going to Nebraska, or they might be going to Philadelphia, just really different locations, and who's involved at those locations has depended on what that local implementing partner can pull together on behalf of those clients. Many have really significant volunteer communities, because it's hard to do this without it. So all those people that are volunteering are mentoring clients for unemployment, for example, how to find their faith community, for example, how to navigate public schools. So I think here in the United States, it's really a local endeavor, and it works better if there are more people involved. The system itself structurally is not supportive in enough ways. We take really large numbers of refugees, right, in the United States. I mean, we are getting ready to resettle 55,000 Afghans in the next few weeks, like huge numbers. And so part of the reception and the integration is preparing communities for arriving refugees and making sure all the systems are aware, so that the public school system doesn't go into a frenzy and the health system doesn't go into a frenzy. So there's a lot involved, could definitely be done better, but
how could we do better? How to improve things?
Such a good, hard question. I mean, all the way from the beginning of how it's structured, the resettlement system is structured in the United States, the president determines a ceiling number. If you get an inhospitable administration, you can get that number completely whacked back, which we've had over the last 4 years. And that just starts to dismantle the whole system, because the payment funding stops. And now we're in this building back, arduous process of pulling all that infrastructure back together. So first and foremost, like the level of control the executive office has over the whole system is extraordinary and not advisable. And then I would say there's some good supports around trauma. So we run case management for people who have extra vulnerabilities, be they medical, mental health, at all of our sites. But we could really use more investment there. And we're coming up with creative models to, we do more psychoeducational work. So there's the intensive trauma work, and then there's more lighter touch community leaders involved, coming up with different models that will address everyone's needs. So that's probably a conversation.
Earlier you mentioned about this algorithm that you used in HIAS for resettlement, I suppose to match refugees' skills and also communities where they are gonna work. How is this working, and when did you start working with this algorithm?
Yeah, the conversation started with the university partners, I want to say in 2016, and then we launched in 2018. And Worcester Polytech is one lead on it, and Oxford University is another, and there's additional researchers involved. And it was, years of conversation where the researchers were really kind of embedding themselves in our work to understand, because it's complicated stuff, right? So it took a level of investment on their part to really understand it. And then since 2018, we've been using it. Now our resettlement numbers were pretty thin over the last 2 years, but now we're kind of gearing up for many more arrivals. So it'll come into use much more, but it kind of gave us a testing period to work out some kinks and add some new features. And yeah, it's been great. And I think when our numbers do go back to sort of normal numbers, it'll be incredibly helpful, because otherwise humans are making all these decisions around what's an optimal placement. Does the site have language capacity for Congolese communities? And can the housing market manage a family of 10? And all that other stuff that goes into factoring where to place people now has more of a algorithm attached to it. Yeah.
And I was wondering, maybe this question for all of you, which other areas do you think the research community that works with algorithms and optimization problems could help towards the well-being of the refugees and asylees? I don't know if maybe Richard?
It can help in a number of ways, because as Alicia's saying, it's around actually optimizing what's going on. So algorithms and various tech can actually help to drive improvements in inequality, because you're working with people's lives and helping people re-establish. And so the pandemic has shown us that classroom-based, bricks and mortar-based approaches aren't always the best. There needs to be like a flexible, dynamic set of provision. So where the algorithms that can look at is as much as anything helping the agencies working with refugees make better informed decisions, because they can pull in so much more big data and turn it into answers, rather than relying on an individual who might know somebody to develop a future.
Awesome. Someone else? Thank you, Richard.
I mean, one thing I've thought about is, in the United States, there are definitely resources, and oftentimes refugees don't or can't access them. And so, for example, there's a whole Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act for workforce training, and there are established training programs for those who are harder to employ. But because of language gaps and because of sort of cultural misunderstandings, refugees don't always avail themselves to the resources that are there. There's like a disconnect that happens. And in our work, we have a lot of case managers that are doing that bridging. But it seems like there should be a better solution to getting to those resources. And I don't know what it is exactly, and if it has some really elegant solution. That's my fantasy is, it's a very labor intensive line of work we're in. And like has been said, it kind of relies on the super fantastic case manager locally that does all this connecting. And I wish there was sort of a more efficient, labor-intensive way to access resources that are there.
And talking about labor problems, do you see maybe some potential reform or policy that in the labor market that may help to refugees to get jobs easily? Maybe there are some restrictions or something. I don't know. I ask that because here in, for example, in Peru, we're actually the second country that are welcoming Venezuelans that are, leaving their countries, and Colombia is the first country that they're welcoming Venezuelans. And one of the things that we're working here was trying to help in the harmonization of degrees, for example, and help to speed up the process to you validate your degrees. I don't know if you have such benefit or such a policy there in UK and in US. So maybe we can start with Richard.
With the degrees and things like that, they can be validated, but majority of refugees that we work with, probably 96% haven't got the degrees or those professional things. So we've got like interesting points at the moment where we've got like a massive shortage of drivers, and we've got whole populations who haven't got the English language levels to secure the license to get those jobs. So there's a need for like mechanisms that actually facilitate access into high demand jobs, as much as there is for those with the degrees, because when they're going to go into a winter with possibly 45,000 too few care workers.
I see.
Things like that.
So I suppose the policies that you may need are more in the area of skill them up, right? Training them, I don't know, give them some knowledge to then work in something.
Yeah, so for us, it's looking at how we can actually fast track that process into the labour shortages that there are, and at the moment, there is now starting to become a move towards better facilities, but there's also in the background there's a hostile environment to refugees as well. So if we start providing too much for refugees, there'll be a backlash because the white working class also need it. So there's for all of our desires and wants to create a better system that makes real good use of like a superb set of individuals. There's another set of people go, we don't want them here. They're others, they're foreign, and let's hold them back. Sort of thing.
Okay, thank you, Richard. Alicia, would you like to share something about it?
Yeah, know that HIAS actually works in Latin America and has been resettling Venezuelans in neighboring countries for quite a while. So yeah, we're over there as well. In the US, I would say same idea that I'm less concerned with the people that come in skilled. There are services that translate diplomas and find them and support skilled laborers. So I think it is the majority that fall outside of that category that, we work hard on trying to find solutions for. So I think the skilling up in an efficient way is what's top of mind, and we're trying different things. I think the other thing that we've been doing is, as we get approached by corporations, and we get approached a lot because people want employees, really trying to negotiate hard about, well, what can you give them? I mean, what kind of training programs can you put on site in a facility that helps them, skill up? So, in this labor market, we have some leverage to do that now. But really trying to figure out, both from government sources, the private sector, how to support clients more adequately.
Awesome, thank you. Paulina, going backward in the process, right? Because now we are talking about labor and resettlement, and going to the decision of deportation. Do you see any impact from the use of algorithms and AI in law for deportation cases?
No, so as I put in the chat, when Francisco asked, there's not like an algorithm that's used to generate a decision. Our system is very people-based, and that person is the adjudicator, whether it be an officer from USCIS or an immigration judge, or then even higher at the appellate courts. Like I said, the Supreme Court has put a number on showing future persecution. They said it's about 10%, but because our system is so adjudicator based, that's another issue that we have with our system in the United States, is that there's tremendous variation from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. I practice both in the Arlington Immigration Court and the Baltimore Immigration Court. So there may be a difference in the number of asylum grants from that court to that court, and it's maybe not even like an hour drive. And then even within one immigration court, there may be a ton of variation as well. We used to have pretty high grant rates in the Arlington Immigration Court, but unfortunately, with some of the more recent appointees, we're seeing some immigration judges have very, very low grant rates. In fact, one immigration judge who was appointed under the last administration has been on the bench since June of 2020, and since then has only granted one asylum case. So you see a tremendous amount of variation across the system, and maybe that's because there isn't any sort of system in place. I will say the other one system that was a negative factor that was implemented under the last administration was that they were tracking judges' decisions to see that they were going through a certain number of cases per year, and also to see like how many grants. And I've heard of immigration judges being reprimanded for granting too many cases. And also the amount of cases that they heard in a year could also determine future raises, future promotions, things like that as well. And that really, for me, that's for me showing like an algorithm or a system being used in a harmful way, because to put that kind of pressure on an immigration judge that you have to hear a set number of cases in a year really calls into question due process, because not every case is going to require the same amount of time, but some are going to require more time, more care, more research to be done on the legal issues. And each person should be entitled to an independent evaluation of their cases and not feel the pressures right from their higher ups to have to make a decision in a very fast, rushed manner. And so I'll say that. I will just add one note to like a previous question. I don't know an exact place to like, where algorithms would be like helpful in the kind of work that I do, but I will just say like a note for researchers. I would just like to, I guess, caution you or ask that like the human element always be there, right? Because I think Richard said this, but asylees and asylum seekers aren't like the same. Like they're going to be different culturally, like what their backgrounds are. And I think that there's this idea that we kind of lump everyone in together. And I represent folks from 30 countries around the world currently, and they all have different things going on. Unfortunately, because our system here in the United States is so politicized, I think a lot of times people control the narrative in a negative way and villainize asylum seekers by sort of lumping people into these huge groups. Like we hear rhetoric like there's swarms of people or hordes of people coming in and these huge groups and stuff like that. And I think that a way to combat that, right, is to put more of a human element and to talk about the individual stories. What are the motivating factors for people having to make this migration, right? Sure. A lot of it is, and I always tell people, think about it like if you were in that situation. I'm not married, I do not have children, but if a gang member was threatening the life of my child, I can imagine that I would probably do everything in my power to protect my child and get them to safety. And so I think that we need to be talking more about the stories and the reasons why people are doing this. And many of my clients even say to me, I never imagined I would be in the United States. I never wanted, it was never my intention to go to the United States. I had a happy life here. I love my country, but I had to, for safety, I had to flee. And so I guess when you're all doing your research, I would just ask, right, that there be that human element present.
Thank you, Paulina. So we are already 1 minute ahead. Alicia, there is a question for you here in the chat box. I will just read it and please ask you maybe to answer to the person offline, if that would be fine. Yeah. So the question was about how you have been assessing the performance of the matching algorithm for refugees and localities in the theme of bridging policy and practice, where there are any discrepancies in terms of what academics prioritize versus what individuals such as yourself in the field prioritize for algorithm success. I think it's
Yes, I did see that. But actually, I'm so sorry, but I have a
Yeah,
1:15, so I have to drop off. And I'll connect with
Francisco and to
yeah.
answer to him. I totally understand. Thank you very much for you. And I think it was a very, very nice conversation. I learned a lot from you, and I'm sure the audience also learned a lot and have more questions about it. Thank you for your time, and I think I have to close the session now. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye all.
Thank you. Thanks, Paulina. That was amazing. Thank you so much.
Gracias, Paulina. Thank you, Richard.
It's a pleasure. All right, okay, bye.
Thanks, Richard. Bye.
Camille Harris, Amy Bruckman, and DK, who are also at Georgia Tech, and Ayanna Howard, who's now at Ohio State University. Our work is focusing on mitigating the racial biases in toxic language detection datasets using an equity-based ensemble framework. In recent years, there's been increasing levels of hateful language on social media platforms. In response, these private companies are now using automated moderation to moderate public discourse. However, there's many challenges in using machine learning for this, such as label subjectivity, class imbalances, and annotation biases, which make machine learning systems quite difficult to be fair. Our work is particularly interested in the recent work that has revealed that annotation biases in these datasets exist against users of African American English dialect. When we take the usage of AE as a proxy